Now the time has come, so we would like to start the symposium, New Electricity Network Created by Distributed Energy, hosted by Japan Renewable Energy Foundation. Despite the bad weather, thank you very much for such a large audience. After March 11, in Japan, not just the power, but the new energy system, how it should be, is being questioned at stake. So, new electricity network, energies network, from 40 years ago, not just focusing on hardware, but the software should also be improved, focusing around distributed power network. Dr. Amory Lovins has been promoting that, and with Mr. Amory Lovins, we would like to have this symposium. From June this year, Mr. Lovins has been the board member of our foundation. So in opening the symposium, I'd like to invite Mr. Takejiro Sueyoshi, the Executive Board Vice Chair, Japan Renewable Energy Foundation, to give us some opening remarks. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for such a large attendance for the symposium hosted by Japan Renewable Energy Foundation from different areas. And also, I'd like to take this opportunity for your daily support to our activities at the Japan Renewable Energy Foundation. Now, in the world, we are starting to see the replacement of the economies, or the shift of transformation of economies, that is, have started. What kind of transformation? What was driving the economic growth in the 20th century? This was only the growth-only economy, neglecting the environmental burden led by brown economy, so to speak. So from such a brown economy in the 21st century, what we need, the sustainable society should be developed. So now it has shifted to a green economy from brown economy. So from brown to green, economic major shift has started. That's what we can say. When I say transformation of economy, it's not an easy task to change economy fundamentally, and the society which supports the economy has to change drastically as well. And amidst such a major transformation, energy area has to play a major role. There has to be an energy transformation in a major way. As you know well, looking at Germany, for instance, renewable energy-focused energy mix, they have already started that. In German language, Energiewende. In other words, they're calling it major energy transformation, as you know well. So Energiewende, after the end of the Second World War, is indeed the biggest change. Look at the UK. Just the other day, the ministry in charge of the climate change proudly said the following: UK by 2020 reduce the CO2 emission by 34% compared to 1990. And UK has been going through that path steadily. And he also added that for the new energy infrastructure from 2010 to now, 35 billion pounds, or 5 trillion yen, roughly speaking, has been invested. And furthermore, by 2020, 110 billion pounds, 15 trillion yen, will be invested. That's what the minister said. In 2008, for the first in the world, CO2 emission target was regulated by law. 80% reduction by 2050 that has been announced. Needless to say, Japan as well need to coexist and compete with these countries. If that's the case, Japan has to also go through a major transformation of the society and energy, and one pillar for that is energy transformation for sure. The good news here is that with March 11 as a trigger, there has been a heightened active discussion around energy in Japan. On the other hand, the bad news is that it still remains that the venue for the fair discussion is limited, or there is almost no venue for such fair discussion on energy. What is indispensable for a fair discussion on energy, firstly, is to share information. So far, only the stakeholders or the experts share the information, but those have to be shared widely among the general public, including the consumers. Such information need to be shared in a wider way. However, in Japan, the information is still very much limited. Or sometimes we hear misinformation or disinformation should be avoided. Intentional misleading information should be avoided. Another important thing is the global perspective. If you look around the world, renewable energy is emerging rapidly, and there has been a dynamic changes. However, the trouble is in Japan, we're only looking at domestic Japan as the premise of our assumption or the discussion. If we do so, we cannot catch up with the global change. Having said that, however, even in Japan, the time has ended where we can just leave the energy issue to the government or to the companies. It's everyone's business. The energy has become everyone's business at hand. Then selecting energy, it's your own right. But on the backside of that, it comes with the responsibility. So the right and responsibility to choose energy. So we are now in the new era for energy in that way. So what is happening across the globe and what is about to happen in Japan will be presented to you today, so that your discussion around energy will be even more active, so that we can be of any help for your further discussion on energy. Then our foundation is very much pleased. Ever since our establishment, fairness and expertise and a global perspective on energy has been the motto for our various activities. To conclude my remarks, Mr. Amory and Mr. Muraki and Mr. Inoue, Mr. Nasara, and Mr. Yamasaki, thank you very much for giving your valuable advices. Thank you very much.
Thank
you very much, Mr. Sueyoshi. We are the Japan Renewable Energy Foundation, and for the new energy deployment, we would like to continue with the efforts. So without further ado, we'd like to start the keynote speech or keynote speeches. We have two speakers. First is Dr. Amory Lovins. He is the co-founder and chief scientist and chairman of Rocky Mountain Institute. For 40 years, he has been advising to the DOE of the United States as well as various governments in the world, and he is a very well-known, very well-renowned researcher, and also he has many joint business activities with companies.
Konnichiwa.
Good afternoon.
The great honor of sharing with you some electricity insights about where the technological and marketed revolution in small-scale distributed energy networks is leading and what it could mean for Japan. These remarks begin with a very quick summary of what 60 colleagues and I learned from performing an ambitious synthesis of American energy opportunities that I think have wide implications and opportunities in Asia. And we published the results 2 years ago as a documented business book called Reinventing Fire. It's been published also by Diamond in Japan. It has extensive notes and references that are online to supplement what is in the book. Now, This book, published in English under the title Reinventing Fire, shows with many practical examples and very detailed analysis a very surprising thing. It showed how by 2050 the United States could run a 2.6 times bigger economy at $5 trillion lower cost than business as usual. This counts all externalities at zero. And this economy would not need any oil or coal or nuclear energy. It would use 1/3 less natural gas than now. It would emit 82 to 86% less carbon. And it would need no new inventions and no acts of Congress. Rather, this transition could be led by business for profit, enabled by administrative and subnational policy shifts that need no new national laws. And this transition includes an 80% renewable, half distributed, and highly resilient electricity system, which I'll say more about later. To achieve this result, we followed advice reputedly from General Eisenhower that expanding the boundaries of a tough problem makes it soluble by including what the solution requires. So Reinventing Fire integrated all 4 sectors that use energy: transportation, buildings, industry, and electricity. And it integrated 4 kinds of innovation, not just technology and policy, but also design and business strategy. These combinations give much more than the sum of their parts, especially in creating deeply disruptive business opportunities, and most of all, in electricity. Now, the electricity sector is undergoing 2 related revolutions in saving electricity and in making it differently. And these promise more numerous, diverse, and profound disruptions than in any other sector, as 21st century technology and speed collide head-on with 20th and 19th century institutions, rules, and cultures. Indeed, this familiar image of how most people think about electricity, with big power lines bringing bulk power from giant stations far away, this is the opposite of where modern trends are taking us. To be sure, this system has served us very well in the past. It is what keeps these lights on today. But this model is rapidly becoming less important to our future, as I will explain. PricewaterhouseCoopers just published a poll of electricity executives at 53 companies in 38 countries. 94% of the electricity leaders predicted complete transformation of or important changes to utilities' business model. Distributed generation was considered an opportunity by 82% and a threat by only 18%. But 57% of these utility leaders, including 62% in Asia and 90% in North America, found a high or a very high likelihood that distributed generation would force significant change in utilities' business model. This number may have been smaller in Japan, I think. 77% in Asia expected a mix of distributed and centralized generation, but 15% said distributed generation will largely replace central plants. And I think the market is rapidly shifting towards that view. So here are some basic shifts happening in the electricity business. For a long time, the mostly regulated utility model, monopoly model, was strikingly successful in providing fairly cheap and reliable electricity. And it was equally incapable of forestalling large-scale side effects like acid rain, climate change, vulnerability to terrorism, and so on. Initially, power stations cost more, but were more reliable than the grid. So they backed each other up through the grid, which also shared the costly capacity. It combined diverse loads, and it made big and urban customers subsidize the power lines going into the countryside. But these basic assumptions have reversed, because now power stations cost less than the grid, and they're more reliable than the grid. 98 or 99% of all power failures, say in my country, originate in the grid itself. So now the cheapest and most reliable power is made at or near the customers, also enabling cogeneration of heat and electricity. The average load in 3/4 of U.S. households does not exceed 1.5 kilowatts. And in 3/4 of commercial buildings, the average load does not exceed 12 kilowatts. So 1,000 megawatt or million kilowatt power stations are hugely mismatched to the size of most loads that they serve. Power plants also stopped getting more efficient in the 1960s, bigger in the 70s, cheaper in the 80s, and bought in the 90s. A huge gap in cost between giant coal and nuclear plants and mass-produced railcar transportable combined cycle gas turbines created customer tensions that coincided with deregulatory ideology in the 1990s restructuring that happened in most industrial countries, except not so much in Japan. And this created new market entrants, unbundled prices, competition at all scales, and that unleashed a swarm of distributed competitors that are now taking over the market, except in Japan. New generating units in many other countries are now typically at the 1940s size and heading for the 1920s size. That is, unit scale has fallen 1 or 2 orders of magnitude. It's now falling another 2 to 4 orders of magnitude, because now we're starting to consider not just economies of scale, but also diseconomies of scale. Serious grid vulnerabilities are putting a very high premium on the national security benefits of distributed and resilient grid architecture. And until now, customers and utilities have had little information about where electricity goes, what it does, what it costs instantaneously to make and to deliver. And utilities have had no real-time data beyond the substation. But customers would only see one total consumption number for the previous month. And now information technology and telecommunications are changing all that. And they're accelerating a kind of axis shift that is making the world of electricity revolve not around the utility or the power station, but around the customer. And the question I suspect utilities will have to answer to historians when they look back on what was really pivotal is whether utilities and regulators accept wrenching but constructive change before the marketplace enforces destructive change, a Schumpeterian creative destruction of an obsolete model. So today, at least 12 game changers are transforming the whole electricity industry. Demand is more likely to go down than to go up. especially with regulatory reform that rewards lower bills, not higher sales. Efficiency and demand response are very cheap, and in 3/5 of the United States, they can bid directly against electricity generation in auctions run by the grid operators. In a recent big auction, 94% of the winning bids were from the demand side. Expanding returns to efficiency investments are also emerging, as I'll describe at the end. Massive supply shifts are happening. Coal is going away in the world market. Nuclear is also fading as too costly to compete. Gas is improving but not cheap. Prices are volatile and rising. And renewables and combined heat and power are taking over the global market, as I'll summarize in a moment. There are existential threats to transmission as well. It is hard to build, especially in densely populated countries. It's fatally vulnerable to accident and malice, and resilience is becoming vital. I've mentioned the order of magnitude shift in the size of generators. Electricity systems are losing financial stability. And it's a little like what happened in the telecoms industry with cell phones. And the systems are becoming permeated with information. It's electricity meets information technology. So demand is becoming flexible. The grid is becoming more agile. The need for central control of the grid is decreasing as intelligence becomes more distributed. And customer centricity is reshaping everyone's business and revenue and regulatory models as utilities and customers and a huge number of other entities compete not just in making electricity, but in providing many different services that electricity delivers to the users. So, will electricity institutions reform, learning to integrate variable renewables at scale? Will they reform before radical bypass shatters their old model? Well, nobody knows, but as Jack Riggs says, the industry is entering a new world, more complex, dynamic, volatile, global, nonlinear, digital, virtual, and distributed. Insurgents, he says, thrive there, unburdened by the legacies of physical and political constraints. No other industry, not even in IT, is facing such a typhoon of swirling and potentially destructive changes all at once. These are exciting times. Now, the world does continue to build fossil-fueled power stations planned long ago. The annual changes in the operable capacity worldwide went down for nuclear. They've been going up rapidly for solar photovoltaics and for wind power. They have risen some, tailed off a little for hydropower. And they're still fairly high for fossil fuel. Most of those plants were planned back in this period. And there was a big spurt in China, but 2/3 of those plants were not authorized by the Chinese government. They were built illicitly at local initiative. So no more nuclear plants are being ordered in any market system, only in centrally planned systems. But renewables now get more global investment each year than fossil and nuclear stations combined. Renewables have added half of all new generating capacity in the world starting 2008, and they now add slightly more capacity than all non-renewables combined. Note that curves here for photovoltaics, for wind, these two will cross this year, and for other renewables not shown must be added together to make the renewable total, which is up here somewhere in the 80s of gigawatts added per year. And renewables costs are falling so fast that last year they got 12% less nominal investment than the year before, but they added 6% more capacity. So let's look closer at the two main kinds of non-hydro renewables, wind power and photovoltaics, and these are their annual net additions in the world. The capacity to make solar cells is now about 75 gigawatts per year, twice the rate at which they are being installed. But huge growth in China and increasing use in Japan will quickly soak up that surplus. Electricity generation has become a scalable manufactured product, like making chips or mobile phones. So it used to be that you had to build a multi-billion-dollar power station. It would take 10 years. But now, in those 10 years, you can build each year a photovoltaic factory, which each year will produce enough solar cells that each year those solar cells can produce as much electricity as your station would have produced after 10 years of construction. So the scaling is utterly different. This is why all the old forecasts are wrong. They have not yet realized this new market reality. And thus solar cells are now scaling faster than cell phones did. Last year, China got more new electricity from non-hydro renewables than it got from nuclear and fossil plants combined. Now, worldwide, 2 years ago, renewable power, excluding hydro, mainly wind and solar, invested its trillionth dollar since 2004. In each of the past 2 years, probably also this year, these modern renewables got $250 billion of private investment and added over 80 billion watts. So they have surpassed the total installed global capacity of nuclear power, whose net additions went negative before Fukushima. And the global orders for nuclear and coal plants continue to fade away because they cost too much and they have too much financial risk to attract investors. In the United States, no merchant nuclear plant has been financeable even with 8 years of offers of 100% or greater construction subsidies. And 14 operating or planned nuclear units have been terminated so far this year because just their operating cost can no longer compete in the wholesale market. Now, driving this explosive growth of renewables are plummeting costs, shown here on a logarithmic scale. For photovoltaic modules, now off the bottom of the chart, and for wind farms. And even though U.S. renewables are generally subsidized less than non-renewables, California solar power now costs less than 7 yen per kilowatt hour. New wind power contracts in windy parts of the United States can cost only 2.2 yen per kilowatt hour. Without subsidy, these prices would be about 10 yen for solar and about 4 yen for wind. Compare that with Japanese electricity prices, nearing record highs. And today in about 20 of the United States, despite paying twice the average German cost for installed solar power, entrepreneurs will come to your house and put solar power on your roof with no down payment and beat your utility bill. So if you add that unregulated product to other unregulated products, efficiency, demand response, storage, coordination, this could add up to a virtual utility that can do for you everything the power company has done, but at lower cost with greater reliability. This gives electricity executives nightmares and venture capitalists sweet dreams. And it's going to get worse because as solar costs drop, some of these solar entrepreneurs are realizing rather than offering you no money down, they can give you cash back to put solar on your roof and still make money. So that will further speed adoption. Now, my institute's Electricity Innovation Laboratory, or ELAB, provides a safe place where incumbents and insurgents can talk to each other and create mutual value. And there are many ways incumbent utilities can respond to the insurgents. They can ignore them, which is a bad idea. They can try to block or tax or destroy them. This is also a bad idea because it annoys the customers, so they leave the grid faster. Or there are constructive engagement models. They could buy the competitors and offer their products as their own product. They could be financiers of the new systems. They could be a system integrator, combining any technically qualified offerings in an open source way. They could otherwise develop co-opetition, a cooperative relation with competitors. And ELAB recently published a useful report on new utility business models for this new energy era. And by the way, if you need any further proof of the global shift toward distributed generation, what the Economist magazine calls micropower, which is cogeneration plus renewables minus big hydro, has now more than exchanged its share of global electricity production with nuclear power, just because of superior economics. Now, the Japanese feed-in tariff has sparked rapid growth in photovoltaics, and since that's mainly in small systems on rooftops, it's harder for utilities to stop, especially when favored by local governments, as here in Tokyo. But while photovoltaic growth is much faster in Japan than the global average, it's a less pretty picture when you compare with Germany. Much faster, much bigger than Japan, even though it's very cloudy. Now, per hectare, Japan has 9 times the high-quality renewable energy resources of Germany, and yet Japan generates, excluding hydro, only 1/9 the renewable share of its electricity that Germany does. So why does Japan use least its most abundant energy resources, despite paying some of the world's highest electricity prices? Simply because Japan's utility oligopolies have for decades blocked competition in order to protect their old power stations assets. Now, immediately after 3/11, Germany closed 41% of its nuclear capacity. But they replaced all of that lost electricity in the same year, 3/5 of it through renewable growth, so fast that continuing this for 3 or 4 more years would displace Germany's entire nuclear output before 3/11 with renewables. But in Japan, instead of harnessing abundant renewable replacements for the lost nuclear output, we did the opposite and imported costly replacement fossil fuels. So while the Japanese people suffered discomfort and inadequate electricity, Germany remained a net exporter of electricity, even to nuclear-powered France. While Japan's economy stagnated, Germany's economy remained the strongest in Europe, bolstered by over 380,000 renewable energy jobs, often exporting world-class equipment. While Japan set new records for electricity prices and emitted more carbon, Germany's wholesale electricity price fell by almost 60% since 2008, making its industry more competitive, and its carbon emissions fell or stayed steady as the economy grew. So all these differences arose not because Germany has more renewable energy, quite the contrary, or has smarter engineers or stronger industries, but because German policy gave renewables fair access to the grid, promoted competition, weakened monopolies, and encouraged citizen and local ownership of 2/3 of the renewable capacity. Last year, Germany's nuclear generation hit a 20-year low, while its power exports hit an all-time high. Yet some Japanese utilities are building new coal-fired and gas-fired power plants today, as if they will be needed, as if the renewable revolution were not happening. Some European utilities already made the same mistake and are now in serious financial trouble because buying new fossil-fueled power plants when carbon is being priced and renewables are rapidly growing is about as smart as buying a horse carriage company when automobiles were emerging to overcome London's horse manure challenge. Now here's a closer look at the photovoltaic revolution in Germany. This is how many megawatts were added in each month. And you see at one point they added 3,000 megawatts in 1 month. They added about 1,000 megawatts in 7 different months, typically just before a big drop in the feed-in tariff, which lately has been falling by 1.8% every month. The maximum installation of 3 gigawatts in a month was 2/5 more than Japan installed in the entire first year of its feed-in tariff. And yet Germany has a smaller economy and less sun than Japan. Also a little less land. So here's the cumulative pattern of how Germany has added 35 gigawatts of photovoltaics so far. And of course, this produces the most power on hot afternoons when electricity here is scarcest and most valuable. So that's 4 times Japan's installed photovoltaic capacity. It's more than Japan's installed and proposed photovoltaic capacity, much of which is not being built, perhaps because interconnection is often made so difficult. And it's especially hard to understand the contrast with Japan's photovoltaic growth when you emphasize again that Japan has such world-class solar and electronic companies. It has 5/8 more GDP than Germany, 2/3 more people than Germany, 5% more land than Germany, far more sun than Germany. All that's lacking is policy. And Japan lags even further behind in its cheapest renewable resource, onshore wind power, with less than 3 gigawatts installed, about 1% of the world total, and less than 1 gigawatt in the pipeline. This is because utilities fear wind power as the most fatal competitor to their plants, so they've most effectively worked to keep it off the grid. Only last month did a key committee agree that wind power's capacity contribution should be counted for the first time. Now, in photovoltaics, the modules in the hyper-competitive world market are selling for about 60 cents per watt, roughly 60 yen per watt. They're headed for about 42 yen next year. So the majority of the installed system cost is now the rest of the system. The inverter, the wiring, the racking, the interconnection, and all the soft costs of design and approvals and interconnection. But 3 years ago, my team led an industry workshop showing how to cut these balance of system costs in the United States by about half. The U.S. Department of Energy adopted our analysis as the basis for its policy. Developers began aggressively pursuing this potential, and already last year, the installed cost of German, mostly rooftop systems, was half what it is in the United States, with mostly ground-mounted systems that should be cheaper. So, of course, many of us then examined how is Germany and also Australia achieving such low balance of system costs. And then our installers started to use the same innovations. And some of our installers have already cut this balance of system cost by 50 to 70%, and some think in another year or two they will have cut it by 90%. This would actually beat the Department of Energy targets and bring photovoltaics to grid parity essentially everywhere. And you can do the arithmetic that if the kinds of annual growth that are common in the mature microchip industry were applied to photovoltaics, it would take only into the 2030s or at least 2040s to have enough photovoltaics to meet all United States electricity needs in this way, although actually we would buy a mixture of different sources. Now, this is an eye chart to see if your eyesight is really good. I want to focus on two things. One is, this is from an annual report of wind power cost and performance in the United States. It has probably close to 100 graphs like these showing that year's real data. Here's the interesting one. This is the levelized power purchase agreement price. So the purple is for the windy middle of the United States, which is comparable to the wind resource in many parts of Japan, onshore and offshore. And you see, and the size of each bubble is the installed capacity in a particular project. You see, many of these are down around 20-odd yen per kilowatt hour. And this is a constant nominal price that's good for 25 or 30 years. That's an unsubsidized price around 40 or 50 yen per kilowatt hour. And that's several times lower than the Japanese government assumes wind power would cost onshore in Japan if developers were actually allowed to build it. Now, renewables do cost a lot more in Japan than in the world market, often because of very difficult interconnection or related issues like requiring a 3-year environmental assessment for wind power but none for solar power. But it's still hard to understand why Japanese photovoltaic developers report that even common commodities like wire cables or connecting blocks cost much more in Japan than in the world market. This doesn't make any sense. They're commodities. So we're still trying to understand this, and it does suggest a market with too little competition, but also perhaps it's inflated a bit by the feed-in tariff. These are the German feed-in tariffs in yen per kilowatt hour and valid for 20 years once you install your system. So you can see for the ground-mounted systems below 10 megawatts, it's down to under 13 yen as of January in 2 months. And even for the costliest rooftop system, it's only 18 yen per kilowatt hour. Here's the Japanese feed-in tariff. You see, it's very generous by European standards. And again, why have a feed-in tariff twice the German price in a more favorable climate? Well, perhaps to cope with the difficulty of doing renewables in Japan, which is again a matter of policy. Now, the last I looked on the METI website some months ago, they were showing renewable energy costs based on 2005 data from other countries. Maybe they believe that this is what the world market is still like, but it's not. I mean, photovoltaic prices drop 20 or 30% every year. If you use data a few months old, you're far out of date. And since the new government arrived in Japan, the renewable installation data that used to be reported within weeks are taking many months to be published. This seems strange in a modern information economy. But it is true that foreign experts have systematically underestimated how fast solar costs would come down, where the yellow bars are the actual module prices, and these are different official forecasts, and still the market is outpacing them. Many people also suppose that it will be very expensive to integrate renewables, say wind power, into the grid. Well, many American utilities with many different conditions have studied if you have this much of your capacity coming from wind power, here's how many dollars per megawatt hour it will cost to integrate it into the grid. And it's typically just a few yen per kilowatt hour. It's a few percent extra cost, and it's probably less than the costs of integrating big thermal stations into the grid, requiring big reserve margins and spinning reserve and so on. We need to count that also. Of course, if you allow renewables, let alone efficiency and demand response, to compete fairly against new supply, as we now do in 3/5 of the United States, what would you expect to happen? Well, this condition actually was tried a long time ago in California when they had 37 gigawatts of peak load. And the result was that in less than 3 years of bidding, they got much more than that, 143% of their peak load in distributed generation, mostly renewables, that had been bought or was offered, and also in efficiency they had bought. And they had to stop the auction because in a few more months they would have had to close every fossil-fueled station in California, which would have been a good idea. But I think this suggests that if you really have full, fair competition, even with old technologies, much worse and costlier than today's, you'll probably have too many options, not too few. Perhaps that's exactly why Japanese utilities are so afraid of such competition. It gives more choices than they are offering. And these are extremely large resources. I don't think we need to go into that now, but they're much larger than we need. Another common myth is that solar and wind take a lot of land. Well, I recently did a peer-reviewed paper reviewing this claim and found that exactly the opposite is true, that actually photovoltaics on the ground have the same land use as the nuclear fuel cycle according to the official government assessment, or zero if you put them on buildings, as most now are. And if you put them on just a few percent of US buildings and other structures, that would give all of the annual US electricity needs. Wind power has about 1 or 2 orders of magnitude less land use than either of the other systems, and thousands of times less if you don't need to build dedicated roads. And the common fallacy here is to count as land use the area that the solar or wind equipment is spread across. But in fact, this land is widely used for other purposes. 99% of a wind farm's area is used for farming, ranching, or wildlife or recreation. So saying that the area of a wind farm is the land area in which it is put is like saying that the area of the lampposts in a parking lot is the area of the parking lot. But then where do you drive and where do you park? Well, in the other 99+% that is not actually occupied by this equipment. Now, there's a more fundamental issue here, which I can illustrate for the United States. This map shows the wind resources, where the darker the blue or black color, the stronger the wind, and where we need the electricity. The big load centers are in red, the smaller ones are in yellow, around the red. And usually people say, we need to get the very windiest places and put our wind machines here in the Dakotas, for example, and then build huge power lines to bring it to Chicago. Well, you notice just near Chicago in Lake Michigan, it's at least as windy as in the Dakotas, but it's much closer. Well, you would have to pay for an underwater cable and ice engineering, but it's a very short cable compared to these big lines out to here. Similarly, in the Northeast, the wind resources offshore are more than enough to serve these red areas. And generally, what we find is when we look closer at a more regional or local strategy, the wind resources that may not be as good as the very best ones are essentially the same in cost as the best wind resources far away, when you also count the transmission lines. And the same for solar. We don't need to go to the sunny deserts of the Southwest and run power lines to here, because there is at least half as much sun in the very cloudiest parts of the eastern states, and the differences are usually much smaller than that. So I think in Japan, we often assume that we must put the wind power in Hokkaido or Kyushu and run big power lines. But actually, we were in Ibaraki last year, only 100 kilometers from Tokyo, and that onshore or coastal wind farm operator said he was making a profit even before the feed-in tariff. So I think we need to look at this sort of pattern, as also in Germany, where they've now canceled half of the planned transmission expansion, and the latest studies say they won't need the other half either. And especially as we get new wind machines just entering the market that operate very efficiently with low wind speed, this changes the picture completely. The logical conclusion of this sort of progression is in Denmark, which in 32 years has gone from a few central coal plants to a constellation of wind farms in blue and agricultural waste cogeneration in brown. And they have also used this capacity, mostly locally owned, in a cellular architecture that makes cascading blackouts impossible. This is the policy of the American military for its own bases. It's been used in Cuba, it's been used in my own house to let the local generator work with or without the grid. And there are hundreds of examples worldwide of microgrids that have been analyzed in detail and showing how they would work even without the grid to avoid big blackouts. I'll just skip some of these. Cuba actually went from 224 blackout days to 0 in 3 years. And then when 2 typhoons in 2 weeks shredded parts of the grid, they were still able to maintain critical services in the rural areas. Now, so resilience is a very important argument for distributed microgrids that can disconnect fractally, reconnect seamlessly, using, for example, gas-fired cogeneration, using local renewables like solar power on your roof in a way that works with or without the grid. But there are also powerful economic arguments, which we set out in this book in both languages, showing 207 distributed benefits, mainly from financial economics and electrical engineering, that can increase value often by about tenfold compared to central stations. And our eLab has just published a nice summary of such analyses. I won't go through all the detail of it, but showing that often the distributed benefits are worth as much as the total cost of solar power or more. Now, I'd just like to show you a quick simulation here about how the grid is constructed. Many people say that we need the fossil-fueled and nuclear stations to keep the lights on because they run all the time, but solar and wind power are variable and thus supposedly unreliable. But actually, no power station runs all the time. They all fail. And when they fail, you lose 1,000 megawatts without warning, typically for weeks or months. But, you know, both parts of the statement are wrong, because variable does not mean unreliable. The blue line is the forecast of French wind output during a very stormy month. The red is the actual output 1 day later. In other words, the day-ahead forecast was extremely accurate. And we can now forecast both solar and wind power more accurately than we can forecast demand. But also, when these big plants fail, the grid is designed to back up failed plants with working plants. And in exactly the way that the grid manages this intermittence of big thermal stations, it can also manage the forecastable variations of solar and wind power. So very detailed studies in Europe and in the United States have shown that you can, in fact, run a highly reliable grid on 80, 90, 100% renewables. And I want to show you at the end here one very striking example that we simulated for the isolated Texas grid, which in 2050 should have a summer load shape in 1 week like this, or smaller and less peaky with profitable efficiency. Now, let's meet all of this with renewables. And this grid is not connected to the rest of the United States. It's just Texas. So we first put in wind and photovoltaics. You can see they do vary a lot. Then we meet the last 14% of the annual electric needs with other renewables that you can have whenever you want. Geothermal, small hydro, solar thermal electric with storage, burning municipal waste, burning biogas from the cattle feedlots in combustion turbines. So we're now 100% renewable, but you can see it doesn't very well match the load curve. But now we can take the surplus and put it into distributed storage in smart electric vehicles and ice storage air conditioning, get it back when we want it, and then meet the last bits with unobtrusive demand response. So now we have fully reliable electric supply every hour of the year, and only 5% of the renewable generation is left over to be spilled. So the economics will be very good. And I think this is really the way forward And the reason that the chief energy regulator in the United States says that these big thermal plants have become an anachronism and we may not need any more of them ever. So I end with this set of numbers for you to think about. We're often told that renewables can only play a small role in electric supply. Well, different laws of physics seem to apply in Europe. 23% renewable electricity all last year in Germany, 41% in Denmark, and they had the most reliable electricity in Europe. In the first half of this year, Portugal's power was 70% renewable, up from 17% just 8 years before. Spain, 48%. The lights stayed on just fine, and some of the operators say, we hope we never go back to the old system. It's so dull compared to this. So perhaps this is enough to start a useful conversation, and I'm very grateful for your good work and your kind attention. ご清聴誠にありがとうございました。
ロビン博士、本当にありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Dr. Lovins. The whole world, I'm sure, you understood that the whole world is heading into a great transformation to distributed renewable centered system. We have recently published a brochure at our foundation, which is based on this. Next speaker is from Tokyo Gas, and the chief executive vice president, of Tokyo Gas, Mr. Shigeru Muraki, and he has assumed various posts such as the head of fuels department. And in April of 2012, he became the executive vice president. Mr. Muraki, please. Currently, he is responsible and particularly focusing on smart energy network, which enhances regional cogeneration through ICT. And concerning today's presentation materials, they will be made accessible on Foundation's website later on. And today's seminar is also being videotaped, so you will be able to see it later on. Mr. Muraki, please. Thank you very much for the introduction. I am Muraki of Tokyo Gas. Dr. Amory Lovins has explained about how small is more efficient and what benefits there are in introducing and expanding small-scale distributed renewable-based energy networks. And we also feel that renewable energies are very important, but there's a problem related to stability. So stability and reliability will be the key to expand the use of distributed renewable energy sources. And I think for that we need to integrate also the cogeneration system. And I'd like to focus on that part, particularly the competitive renewable energies are going to be introduced. And I do not represent a utility who fears the new entry by expanded renewable energy providers. The kind of smart energy network that we have in mind, this is a distributed energy network, and in introducing much renewable energy sources, not just electricity, but heat and electricity should be provided through this grid and through this smart energy network. And natural gas cogeneration with its low CO2 emission, I think, should be combined with renewable energy sources to produce not just electricity, but heat there is unused heat, which should also be provided. So optimum use will be very important, and ICT should also be integrated to build an overall smart energy network. In addition to that, after March 11th earthquake, just depending on large-scale grid is risky. So standalone, distributed and controllable network is desirable. And for that, cogeneration should also be included. And if there is a trouble on the grid side, that could work on a standalone basis to provide required amount of energy. And introducing distributed energy systems, in Japan, we still face difficulties in power supply and demand, and there are still constraints. So cogeneration and distributed power source can be sited very quickly, which is an advantage. And if we make a combined use of that, we can very efficiently and quickly expand power supply. So I think we need to proactively promote the introduction of renewable resources as well as distributed energy systems, and to focus on disaster preparedness, disaster mitigation, as well as BCP to improve competitiveness of cities, regions, and industries. And I'd like to focus on 3 models. The first model has to do with plants of industries which use much heat, such as steel, chemical, and food industries, and large gas turbines, 30 to 100,000 kilowatt, will be introduced. And concerning power supply, if there is a problem on the grid side, it can be used as a security power source. And for unused energy and power and heat, it can be sold externally in the market. And for sales of surplus power in the market, starting last year, a green energy market has been set up, and the trading in the green energy market has started, and we aggregate about 20,000 kilowatts of power, and we sell in the market. So that's a plant-based power supply model, and this one is an industrial estate type of power supply model. And consideration and study is being underway in multiple sites. And the final model has to do with the urban or urban development model. Based on the experience of March 11th earthquake, in the urban areas, these building complexes, commercial buildings and shopping centers, about 50% of the usual demand, if that can be supplied by a standalone type of own power supply, even if there is some failure on the grid, the security power supply can be secured. For example, there are many elevators, so one of those elevators at the minimum can be operated even if there is a grid failure, and air conditioning would also work. And also in case of disaster, we would like to accept the people who are visiting the site or the neighborhood, and that will lead to business and living continuity plan, we feel. So a certain size building complex in the development of such city complexes, a certain amount of standalone power supply will be installed. In case of development of a building of 200,000 square meters, power demand will be about 10,000 kilowatts. And if cogeneration is half of that, and if we assume 43%, then we will be able to introduce generating capacity, 43% generating capacity gas turbines. And in case of large-scale development of 600,000 square meters, like the Roppongi area, which is about 650,000 square meters, the power demand would be about 30,000 kilowatts, and cogeneration scale would be 15,000 kilowatts, and cogeneration generating efficiency 49%, which means the energy conservation benefit will be about 34%. And we combine various power sources like waste heat from sewage treatment and vapor and hot water and so on. And we link power and the heat and expand the scale of power supply and to secure security. And in the future, dynamic pricing for power trade and the peak power price perhaps could be set very high. If that happens, then peak load must be reduced. And for that, negawatt trading will be useful. And if that can be used, then economic viability will improve further. And for that, low carbon type of city planning will be very effective, and I think we'll be able to contribute to overseas as well. This is not part of your handout, and this data is not made public yet. It's being compiled by the Advanced Cogeneration and Energy Utilization Center. Currently, about 10,000 kilowatt cogeneration will be increased threefold by about 2030 to about 31 million kilowatts. And total, that's the installed capacity, and the total generation will be 155 billion kilowatt hours. That means about 15% of total generation can be supplied by cogeneration. And then through shale gas revolution, we expect the natural gas share will be reduced from the current 70% to 60%. And then we will be able to introduce power supply based on the relatively low cost. And also, there will be further deregulation and introduction of fuel cells for household use. If we add up all these effects and benefits, then I think we'll be able to contribute to restructuring the overall energy mix and energy use in Japan. And I'd like to introduce some examples. In Isogo, we have 24 units of company employee housing. This is a collective housing, and we have solar heat and photovoltaic and fuel cell installations. And there is HEMS introduced, home energy management system for each household unit. And overall integration is done by the community energy management system. And we are doing demonstration and testing fuel cells, not just one or two introduced, but 2 fuel cells is introduced per unit, and we share the power among the units.
So visualization, and by having such integrated control, the power demand can be reduced by more than 20% according to our results. So as for the home fuel cells, from 2009, as you can see here, PEFC or polymer electrolyte fuel cells has been sold right now by Panasonic and Toshiba are selling PEFC with 39% of the power generation efficiency, and more than 90% of the total efficiency can be gained if you use up all the power. And as a next generation, SOFC or solid oxide fuel cells have been launched. I just started. And at high temperature, the efficiency of the generation is more than 45% higher than the grid efficiency, and the overall efficiency is more than 90%. For SOFC in Japan, we're here using Kyocera cells, iShin, and JX are offering these products. But other than that, Toto and Murata Manufacturing, Miura, and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, those Japanese manufacturers are working on the development, and overseas fuel cell energy voucher are working on the development of such fuel cells. Now for the fuel cells, in 2009, this started, and now at Tokyo Gas, about 30,000 units, and nationwide 70,000 units have been installed. Now there's still a subsidy system, 450,000 yen per unit of subsidy, and the end user's initial burden is about 1.2 million yen. And by 2015, the subsidy system will remain. So towards that, we are working on reducing the cost so that after 2015, the end users' cost burden will be reduced to 800,000. That's our target. 800,000 yen. If that is achieved, and it has hot water supply equipment, so it can be recovered over 10 years or so. 50 to 60,000 yen of energy saving per year in the detached house, which can be recovered in 10 years. So that's the model that we're targeting. It will be introduced to the condominiums, and also with the expansion of the electricity vehicles, the similar technology can be applied for the further cost reduction, and also to roll them out overseas. By so doing, in 2020, Tokyo Gas would like to go for 300,000 units, and as a gas industry or as a whole in a nation, 1.4 million units, and in 2030, 5.3 million units is the target for the country. For cogeneration, to improve the efficiency of the power generation is very important. Right now, the grid thermal power plant efficiency is 41%. So anything that can go beyond that, cogeneration. In the case of gas engine, 370 kilowatts, 41%. So for a larger scale, this goes beyond the grid efficiency. So using a waste heat as an overall integrated power generation efficiency, it's much effective. But for a smaller system, the fuel cells have high efficiency, whereas the gas turbine efficiency goes down. So for a smaller scale, fuel cells, PFC or SOFC, utilizing a waste heat or hybrid type turbines, can gain more than 50% of the efficiency for the smaller scale. So with such a product lineup, we would like to promote the cogeneration. Now, in the town building models, let me share with you some of the case examples. So in front of the Tamachi station, this is the development that we're working on. After 2014, the buildings will be built after next year. High-efficient cogeneration will be combined with solar power, with photovoltaic, and make it into a network. And using ICT, it will be controlled. So smart energy network, energy management system, SENEMS, together with Hitachi, are being developed right now. From Energy Center, the data on the demand side are looked at. So rather than simply supplying energy as needed, but to have a control from the demand side, so that it's a demand response. So the optimal energy control system will be introduced. As we do so, be it renewable energy or less CO2 emission energies, will be prioritized for the usage to promote CO2 reduction and energy saving. As for others, in Nihonbashi Muromachi, done by Mitsui Fudosan, total floor is 1 million square meters, 50,000 kilowatts demand, so 25,000 kilowatt cogeneration for power in the case of the emergency. So in any accidental case, to have a self power generators and cogeneration can operate continuously. So even for a long period of blackout, about half of the power demand of these buildings can be accommodated. It will start in 2019 with the existing district to have this kind of BCP. It's the first of its kind. This is in the west area of Shinjuku. This is Ome Street and this is Koshu. And in the west area of Shinjuku, there is area-wide air conditioning locations, 5 of them. And we'd like to make it into a network by introducing renewable energies to make a network of the unused energies. And already in April this year, in front of the station on the west side, the cooling and air conditioning, and the biggest, including the Tokyo Metropolitan Government Office, the integration of heat has started already. And to also introduce a large-scale cogeneration, 8,000 kilowatt cogeneration plant right there, but 3,000 is supplied to the Tokyo Metropolitan Government starting from the last year. In 2015, the plant shall expand the capacity to 20,000 and also expand the supply of power. And in the future, eventually 50,000, so that we can increase the share of the usage of the unused energy. So we call it Smart Energy Network. So the value provided here is not just energy saving, but in the community area, we can provide a safety where people will easily be active to activate the community, to also increase the value of the property values. Those can be gained. And from the perspective of the commercial or business, BLCP, Business Living Continuity Plan, to contribute to the local economy, such a further value added can be gained. That's very important. We call this non-energy benefit. Such value added, what do we mean specifically? This is at the Shinagawa station. There's a major redevelopment project in front of the Shinagawa station. A very large space of 400 hectares, and using the waste heat from the garbage disposal facility to improve the efficiency, and BCP functions will be enhanced in this town building project. In terms of the cost, 4.8 billion yen of cost per year, but just for energy saving, it's only 3.7 billion. But if we add the non-energy benefit, and there are different ways of calculating that. But for instance, according to our simulation, if we add up, it will total 8 billion yen. So such non-energy benefit, by including non-energy benefit, very advanced, and with a higher urban functions, we can build and redevelop the community. And by sharing this with the stakeholders to promote such project is important. Last but not least, for the venues for the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, we believe that these should be leveraged. That's the kind of proposal we're making. The Tokyo Olympics, as being discussed right now, the new national stadium at the Yoyogi Heritage Zone and Harumi Ariake area, so-called Bay Zone, those are 2 main areas for the Tokyo Olympics where the venues will be developed. So between the heritage zone and the base zone, they're very close to each other. Each facility is close to each other, so to make the heat and the electricity into a network. But these two zones are rather distant from each other. So using ICT to have a total visualization and a comprehensive control, so that by high contribution to BCP through high energy independence and energy conservation and carbon reduction, and contribution to system power through peak hour power cuts and cost down, such as operation cost reduction. Those are our proposals. Tokyo Olympics, for the benefit of Japan as a whole, provides a great opportunity for Japan to showcase to the rest of the world. Tokyo Olympics will be the games to be held in one of the major cities, advanced from London, different from Rio or Beijing. That's what we like to promote, and to showcase and develop the Japanese technology through the rest of the world. So with this, I'd like to conclude my presentation on our initiatives on building a smart energy network. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muraki, also for keeping to the time limit. And in the later panel discussion, there will be more in-depth discussion about each individual company's efforts. Mr. Muraki, thank you very much.
So I'd like to start the panel discussion. How to promote the new energy network, not just electricity, but not just from the supply side, how the energy system should be, will be discussed. Mr. Shigeru Inoue of Mitsubishi State, and from Shimizu Corporation, we have Mr. Nasuhara and Mr. Yamasaki from ENET. And the moderator is Teruyuki Ono, the Secretary General of Japan Renewable Energy Foundation. Mr. Ono, please. Because the time is limited, let us start. First, Dr. Amory Lovins talked about the distributed energy network that is expanding in US and Europe. The energy business itself is changing. And Mr. Muraki talked about the excellent technologies that we have in Japan, be it the fuel cells or cogeneration. There have been some innovative development taking place in Japan. So how can we promote, expand that in Japan? The panelists that we have invited today are already applying the technologies in their respective fields. So we'll hear from each of them and ask them to share with us examples of applications. And then afterwards, we'd like to share the nationwide issues and how we can accelerate the expansion going forward by having some comments by Dr. Lovins as well. So first of all, I'd like to invite Mr. Inoue from Mitsubishi Estate, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I am Inoue of Mitsubishi Estate. Mr. Muraki has given an explanation, and he referred to some examples of the city development projects, and I would like, as a representative of a company who is implementing one of those projects, to introduce that. This is the Tokyo Station and Marunouchi Yurakucho area. And as you can see in this map, it's 120 hectares in terms of the area. And there's the Imperial Palace and the Tokyo Station. And there are about 100 buildings which are concentrated in this area. And our company has 1/3 of the land rights of this region, this area. And we are involved in the development projects there. And in the city building or development projects, we focus on energy as well. A big turning point, of course, was the March 11th earthquake, and as an impact on the economy, surge in energy cost, and impact on the environment, increase of emission factor, and impact on the safety is loss of confidence in the grid power. So given the experience of March 11th earthquake, in thinking about the local energy, we thought compatibility of disaster prevention or preparedness and environment were the focal points. And as you can see below on this slide, in terms of securing energy security, we need to have a multiplexed backup type of power source as well as diversification, specifically introduction of cogeneration and expanding and improving emergency generators, as well as diversification of power supply sources. Also, to build high specification energy saving buildings, and also introduction of renewable energy sources will be mentioned later on. In addition, to introduce advanced energy management. In addition to the advanced energy management of a building on a standalone basis, as well as more area-wide type of advanced energy management, including SEMS that Mr. Muraki mentioned earlier. And also district heating and cooling will be introduced. And we also have demonstration of demand response. In the past, there were many projects based on building specific demand response, but demonstration experiment, including the tenant installations, is being done in the Shin-Marunouchi building currently. So the kind of initiatives that we are involved in is to improve the local disaster preparedness, and then from the power source to the building users of power, we would like to cover the whole stream from upstream to downstream, and we are trying to save energy over that whole spectrum. And these are some specific examples. The upper one is the third stage development of the government office building, and it's expected to be completed in 2015. Cogeneration units, 2 units by 1,000 kilowatt, and emergency generator will provide 50% of the summer peak load, and ordinary type of generator 25%, and tenants will bring in 25%. So in total, we can provide 100% of the power supply to meet the load. And I talked about diversification and introduction of renewable energy sources. The lower example is the Shin-Marunouchi building, in line with the cap and trade system of Tokyo Metropolitan Government. In Shin-Marunouchi building, we have wind power, direct purchasing wind power from Aomori Prefecture, as well as water power from hydro to Hokkaido, to cancel 20,000 tons worth of CO2 emission. By introduction of FIT, feed-in tariff, these power sources are included in feed-in tariff system. So this scheme itself has changed. But before the introduction of FIT, this is an example where we attempted for 100% green power. And then lower right, this 120 hectares that I showed you, if you add together the PV cells, then it amounts to megasite. On-site renewable energy is to be introduced. And this is an advanced building in Kayabacho, and it's an example of efficiency improvement. For example, in terms of the building plan, this is a two-layer atrium type, and there's natural ventilation system. Sorry, I'm having a trouble with the operation. So in terms of the machinery and equipment, there is a radiative type of air conditioning system. And it says heat and power, which are attached to the frame or integrated in the frame. And the frame of the building itself is cooled overnight. And that can be used for cooling or heating on the next day. And there is intelligent lighting system, and the user can choose the optimum control, and also near real-time type of energy use. So power use is made somewhat visible to the users. And on top of the visualization of energy consumption, whether this will be linked to demand response or not will be the issue for the future. And the estimate is 45% energy consumption reduction. And this is the final page. District heating and cooling system and heat management has been done over the past 40 years. As a recent example, district heating cooling system and the cogeneration are being used in an integrated way. Already completed, the Marunouchi building has a cogeneration system. And in terms of the heat exchange or interchange, that is done in this area as a part of heat management. And you see the arrows, and it's a steam interconnection. So the red dots surround the areas. And when there's low heat demand, then cogeneration is operated first, and the surplus will be used for the external applications. And if cogeneration is insufficient, then this plant's boiler will be used, and energy or heat is shared. And then if that is not sufficient, then you have to use another boiler. So there's a prioritization, and it's a very efficient use of the systems. And there's building A and B, and there is heating and cooling plants. And A building has a higher efficiency heat source than B building. So if there is low heat demand, then the chiller can be shared between the two buildings, and carbon CO2 emission can be reduced by 30%, and energy efficiency improved by 20%. So depending on the management of the completed buildings, the heat use or heat consumption changes. So in the future, in addition to introduction of cogeneration, heat and power will be produced in a synchronized way. So energy management has to be made more advanced in this kind of an integrated way, and that will be a challenge going forward. Thank you very much.
井上さんどうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Inoue. Mitsubishi Estate has been quite active on making green energy for their buildings, and this was an example of the local community green energy network. Next is from Shimizu Corporation, Director of Eco BCP Business Promotion Office, Mr. Nasuhara. Thank you for your kind introduction. I am Nasuhara of Shimizu Corporation. So how to promote the new energy network? I'd like to talk about area energy network being the entrance to a smart society. What you see here on the slide. I'd like to draw your attention at the bottom. The three elements to deliver performance. One is the product. For instance, in the construction ZEB, or in the case of the automobile, fuel efficiency. But in fact, it's not just a single unit alone, but as Inoue-san said, the driving techniques or the operation techniques are very important. In the case of the automobile, the techniques of the driver. In the case of the building maintenance company or the operator's capabilities will be very important. And in smart energy network, as Mr. Muraki mentioned, the network to cover all these, by linking all these, the performance will be even higher. So these three elements are very important. So one example for that, the first example is our company's Technical Research Institute. There are 12 buildings, and they are connected through the microgrid. In 2006, this was completed. And according to this data, this is as of 2011, 36% reduction at peak, and the usage was reduced by 30%. Gas engine-related cogeneration and batteries, nickel hydride and lithium ion, electricity double-layer capacitor, and a renewable energy photovoltaics with some power purchase using waste heat of cogeneration, including the heat we are using this. And with this as a case example to be rolled out to others, this is a Chubu University with 12,000 students in Aichi. There is a campus plan, and in accordance with the campus plan, life science faculty built a new building. For this newly built buildings, many factors of smart BEMS and cogeneration photovoltaics and storage batteries are introduced, and with this as a core, by faculty department basis, in accordance with the campus plan, this will be expanded, and at the end, the entire campus will be made into smart. Step 2 was completed in summer this year, and they're now moving into step 3. As of last summer, 25% power saving and 30% energy saving was achieved. Likewise, from a single facility to create an area energy network through certification of one building, but if there's a new building or if there's a large-scale retrofit renovation, by focusing in that particular area and in neighboring buildings, provide heat and energy so that we can improve the BCP or accommodate a peak. So key technology is distributed energy, for instance, here, or renewable energy, or batteries. So in an area-wide way, to operate smart BEMS will be necessary. Now, in more architectural factor, at the facility level, we need to have a good performance, be it PV or geothermal or batteries. And the subject here is Eco BCP model building, the large-scale office buildings or public facilities, hospitals, schools, those evacuation areas in the case of the disaster, or the station buildings, are the important buildings in the area. And focusing on those buildings, it will be expanded from facility to block to area. by increasing the area, space or areas covered to interchange the power and heat. And such grid, by linking it in a wider area, smart city or a smart town can be built. So power, heat, and information network to control will be very important. Now, the representative example of the facility is our headquarters building. Overall interchange leads to a new dimension is a title. There are three major energy-saving technologies. One is the exterior, hybrid exterior, and task and ambient AC, air conditioning, the radiant cooling, and task and ambient lighting, LED has been introduced. And for AC, task and ambient AC, using a radiant panel ceiling, and desiccant AC is used for adjustment of the humidity from outside air. So cooling water is supplied from DHC system, or instead, chemically to absorb. But if you just keep it absorbed, it would saturate. So using waste heat to recycle. So we get the heat supply from the area system. So at the top is existing system of coming back with 6 and going with 14. But the radiant AC is functioning between 16 and 18. So 14 or 15 degrees of cooling water that comes back are used as it is to heat our building. At this temperature, there are several in the natural environment, so this can be applied in wider areas going forward. And for desiccant AC, to recycle the absorbed, and here the water is to be released. Waste heat is used to produce a cold water. So 1.39 for the comprehensive energy efficiency, which is Japan's highest figure now. So to promote this is very important. So there are many ways to develop cities, but there are three ways. First is a disaster prevention type, enlarged redevelopment type. And as Mr. Muraki of Tokyo Gas explained, those large-scale projects such as Tamachi Station are included here. But it's not that there are many of such large redevelopment types. So in the existing buildings, how can we expand the area? So we call it the sequential development type. As you can see at the bottom, in a certain block, if there is a new building in a certain block, then in focusing that new building by introducing cogeneration or batteries, so for maybe 3 buildings next to it, interchange the heat and energy to improve the energy efficiency and improve the BCP. So this is one example for simulating that. And with that as a base, we have identified some challenges. For instance, for the public benefit to supply route, the installation of power grids on public roads, and the government agencies or local municipalities or the road construction authority, there is some difference in temperatures. Or concurrent power received from a specified electricity utility easing to 50% or even further with further deregulation. And there are many detailed rules and regulations. So how about making it more flexible? And the permission and permit related, if that can be obtained in a shorter period of time. Or in reality, there's even more difficulties. We are a design team. There are challenges at the planning and design stage. It's very difficult to get the consensus building on area energy network from the initial design stage. So to motivate the related people to reach a consensus, such incentives or the regulations will be helpful, and it requires a certain initial investment. So it's very difficult to make it profitable. And if you are to work on this, the demand side may actually decide to stop participating. So the risk avoidance on that would be a key as well. So in a nutshell, in a large redevelopment type, one-stop contact window and deregulation, and for the sequential development as a preferential treatments, heat and power interchange, deregulation, and to provide incentives for the interchange of the heat and power, and also incentives for the local burden shall be promoted. So smart city creation will be built in each block, and then by linking the different blocks so that we can build a smart city. That's our initiatives and efforts. Thank you.
どうも、那須原さん、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Nasuhara. I have also visited the head office building of Shimizu Corporation. It's a wonderful building, and there's a cooperation with the whole area in improving the environmental performance. In the energy reform, power reform is very important, and as a representative of PPS, or a new entrant in the power industry, Mr. Shinichi Yamasaki is the director of ENET Corporation. Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Yamasaki of ENET. Some of you may not know about ENET, so very briefly I'd like to introduce the ENET as a company. ENET was established 13 years ago, and energy and network, we coined the name of the company from energy and network, and NTT Facilities, Tokyo Gas, and Osaka Gas are the shareholders of our company. And ENET is a new entrant. It's a PPS, and in terms of the large generation in East Japan area, we use Tokyo Gas power source, and in the West, Osaka Gas power supply. Very clean natural gas power is supplied from Osaka Gas facilities, and we buy power source from 150 locations all over Japan, and we sell them to our customers. And in terms of the power supply, about 70% are from Osaka and Tokyo Gas natural gas fired power plants, and then renewable power sources, wind power and photovoltaic and bio and mini hydro. On the upper left, this is in Hirokawa of Wakayama Prefecture, and it's a wind farm. And under that is Miyazaki Solarway photovoltaic power plant, and also a biomass generating plant. So we buy these clean power sources. So it's a very clean energy mix. And we have about 15 to 16,000 customers. Last year it was 10,000, but in 1 year we were able to increase rapidly the number of customers by 5,000 or 6,000, covering from Hokkaido to Kyushu. Unfortunately, Okinawa is an island, so excluding the area covered by Okinawa Electric Power Company, we provide electricity and services. And ENET's power sales per year is 10 billion kilowatt hour, so it's slightly more than that of Okinawa Electric Power Company. Having said so, however, and this is a problem, that is the share of the PPS, the new entrants, it's only about 2%, sorry, of the total power supply. and we work to pressurize the government, and various systems have been set up, but we'd like to continue to increase. And among the new entrants or PPSs, Enet's market share is 50.5%. That's all for the introduction of our company. Since March 11 earthquake, customers' awareness has changed. Before the earthquake, cogeneration was positioned in terms of the energy conservation and economic viability and CO2 emission benefits, but since the earthquake, power saving or emergency security improvement, BCP, and energy diversification and introduction of renewable energy sources. So the customers' awareness has changed greatly, and we need to cope with the time of tight power supply, as well as to cope with the emergency and disaster. And in introduction of distributed power supplies, we are also involved in that process and providing products and services. So Enet has in mind various new services, and this is the introduction of new service menu. It's not just to sell cheap power. We have diversified service menu. For example, for the supply side, optimization of demand-supply balance and economic viability can be improved. On the side of the customers or demand side, there is a visualization service which is provided free of charge, and which can lead to power saving and diversification of various services in order to reduce the overall power cost. So I think we can make the whole society happy through our services. And due to the limited time today, I can only introduce two of the new services. For example, for condominiums, we have demand response service. Specifically, for example, in a condominium, there's a tight power supply, for example, and we request the users to try to save the energy consumption, and that cooperation will give incentives to the customers in terms of the vouchers that they can use for shopping in the neighborhood convenience stores or shops. And another example is summer peak load charge is set high, so that works as an incentive to save air conditioning load or power in the summer. And there's a negawatt aggregation service and a smart network service. Using cogeneration, this demand response service, last year we were awarded the Energy Conservation Award. And Enet Osaka Gas jointly developed this service. So Enet, Osaka Gas, and customers are involved in this process. So in case of tight power supply, and for example, cogeneration, some of them may have stopped operation, and we request the cogeneration plants. If they have some room, then we ask them to increase power supply, and that will give a higher demand. And for customers who comply with the demand response, then we give incentives. And there are various advantages or benefits. In terms of the economic viability, customers' cogeneration load may be reduced, or some of it may be unoperational. But by introducing incentives, we will be able to reoperate some idle cogeneration power. And if we have to buy on a spot basis the power from outside, then that will mean increased cost. So by implementing demand response, we can reduce this costly spot procurement, for example. And this is a win-win-win model for all the stakeholders. And this is an actual example. There is some time period in the middle where the bar chart is lower. This is when the customer operated the cogeneration unit, and the purchased power went down. And this is an example of smart community project in Miyako City, and this is going to be implemented in the future. There are various benefits of smart community. For example, a local power source or local customers or local new entrants. For the local power supply, they can make use of feed-in tariff, and they can secure a stable supplier. So biomass, photovoltaic, and mini hydro can be used. And by using the local power source, the local PPS sell to the customers, and there are benefits such as they can realize local power production and consumption, as well as create local employment. And for the local customers, then of course their utility bill will be lower, and they can reduce power consumption, and also benefits from demand response. This is a schematic. On the left-hand side, there is the power supply side. Mega solar, biomass, and mini hydro. So those are used. And on the right-hand side are the customers to which we sell power. And in the middle, there is a local energy management system. And we ask for demand reduction, for example. And there is a balancing rule, supply and demand balancing rule. But that's very difficult to match supply and demand. So if there is shortage, power will be bought from Tohoku Electric Power Company in this case. And if there is surplus, then it can be sold to the wholesale power exchange. So there will be an overall management, energy management. So local smart communities are being discussed in various parts of Japan. And as far as ENET is concerned, using SEM system or balancing power system, we have the know-how. So we'd like to work for an optimum combination of that know-how. Thank you very much.
どうも山崎さん、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. New power, there are more than 100 registered companies, but in fact, half of them are supplied through ENET. And not just the power supply, but the demand management. And it is working on that. It's very promising. Now, we were going to ask each of you to make additional comment, but due to time constraint, with the change in the plan, at this point in time, I'd like to ask Dr. Lovins to make a comment based on what you heard from the three panelists and what is the situation in Japan for the future outlook.
I love the directions that this panel has taken, and I heard two major themes in all three of these talks, and they also were echoed by Maraki-san's talk. The first theme was about resilience and the importance of designing our systems to maintain as normal a life as possible during and after disasters. this is becoming an important theme all over the world, and in a country that is so exposed to natural disaster as Japan, it is a very wise priority. The other main theme that, of course, is very compatible with this is of efficiency, especially in the built environment. And we are starting to see an efficiency revolution all over the world. In the United States and in Europe, electric demand is drifting downwards. In the U.S., electricity use per dollar of real GDP, adjusted for weather, fell by 3.4% last year alone, in 1 year. We've never seen such a thing before, but a lot of it is because of new building standards and new electric utility investment in efficiency. So U.S. electric, and by the way, also gasoline use, peaked in 2007, and they keep going down even as the economy grows. So I think the next stage in this revolution will be integrative design that often gives expanding, not diminishing, returns to efficiency investment. That is, it often makes very large energy savings cost less than small savings. We demonstrated this in over 1,000 buildings, but maybe the best known is the Empire State Building. I co-led the design of a retrofit 3 years ago that is saving 2/5 of the energy with a 3-year payback. This is the same payback that a major energy service company offered, but their savings were 6 times less because they optimized components by themselves. We optimized the whole building as a system. Our latest retrofit of a big office will soon be announced with about 70% savings, still cost effectively, and it's a difficult 48-year-old building. We now have also very good tools for looking at a whole portfolio, such as Mitsubishi Estate has in Marunouchi, to figure out how to do the right steps in the right order at the right time when you are doing other major changes to the building anyway, so you can greatly reduce capital cost. Let's see, 21 years ago, we found in a big building in Chicago that if you did a deep retrofit at the time when you needed to replace the glazing system anyway, you could save about 3/4 of the energy in a typical curtain wall office building with a minus 5-month payback. It was slightly cheaper than the regular 20-year renovation that saves nothing. And the same integrative design principles apply also in industry, but perhaps they are biggest in buildings, and especially in Japan, whose commercial buildings rank 8th in efficiency out of 11 major industrial countries. So, yes, Japan industry efficiency is often number 1, but number 8 in commercial buildings, number 8 in truck efficiency, tied for last with my country in car efficiency. So there is still a great deal of Kaizen to do. And I think this will happen even faster if we pay attention to Muraki-san's very important remark about non-energy forms of value. If you go to, let's see, green, oh dear. Yeah, we'll pull up the website for you. Our colleague Scott Moldavan has posted about a 650-page book which says if your building has this or that efficient or green attribute, it will add this many basis points to your capitalization rate, and here's the evidence. So we saw in Muraki-san's example that the indirect, the non-energy forms of value, thank you, added about as much economic value as the energy savings themselves. They about doubled the value of the retrofit. But often we find much bigger savings even than that. For example, in an efficient office building where you can see better, you can hear better, you feel more comfortable, you breathe cleaner air through better technical design, people do about 6 to 16% more and better work. Well, in a typical building, we pay over 100 times as much for people as for energy. Therefore, the effect of the productivity gain, which was one of the quantities in Muraki-san's bar chart, can be many times more valuable than the energy saving. And as we start to count this using real evidence and real measurement, it will be a very powerful driver of the kinds of wonderful energy efficiency examples that we heard from Inoue-san and Nasahara-san. The website is greenbuildingfc.com. So I think when you blend the efficiency and planning and resilience techniques that we have just heard described, it can be an immensely powerful boost to the whole Japanese economy, and it keeps more wealth in our local communities rather than sending it out of the country to buy fuel.
江森さんどうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Dr. Lovins. Before working for Renewable Energy Foundation, I was working for Tokyo Metropolitan Government for a building renovation, and I was shocked to hear that Japan was number 8 in building efficiency. But you talked about the importance of non-energy benefits or non-economic benefits in promoting efficiency, and for building efficiency improvement and for diversification of energy sources. I think I'd like to ask each panelist to comment, starting with Mr. Inoue, please. 3 minutes each. Well, in our case, compatibility of environment and the disaster preparedness are the major themes in our projects. And NEB, non-economic benefits or non-energy benefits, I think has to be quantified, and that we should have continuous monitoring to visualize quantified and quantitative benefits. Actually, in promoting energy saving too much, then, and if it leads to worse working environment, then of course that's very bad for the building construction. So we have to aim for improving work efficiency as well as energy saving in developing products. So disaster preparedness and environment and economics, those three have to be compatible in the city development as well as building development. Mr. Nasahara, please. Well, I think I briefly touched on this. On a standalone level, in other words, for one building, there are various measures already in place for energy saving. But in making plans, what I feel mostly is the sharing. Well, self-help, for example, means doing it on your own initiative. And for building or facility on its own, that's easy to see and easy to do. And help from the public sector, that may be quite easy. But what's lacking in Japan is sort of cooperation and mutual help from the neighbors and sharing from the neighborhood. And that's lacking also in central Tokyo, like Marunouchi. And when we think about area-wide energy use and networking, that's the kind of thing that we feel great difficulty. So if various incentives can be provided to make that possible, then that may be useful. Of course, we cannot do it on our own, so we need your cooperation as well as sensitization. Thank you very much, Mr. Yamasaki. Yes. Well, today's theme is decentralized energy, and perhaps not directly, but in it, from now on, we'll need to expand our service area and increase market share. And for that, the biggest bottleneck is that we don't have power source. And power source cogeneration is installed by our company's shareholders like Tokyo Gas or Osaka Gas. But we have to sometimes source costly power from power supplies, and in selling to customers, we need to provide variety of services, including demand response, to differentiate ourselves from the incumbent utilities, so that we can make both the demand side and supply side happy. And by doing that, decentralized, distributed energy or smart community, I hope we can contribute to promoting those projects. Thank you very much. Well, from now on, in order to promote distributed energy systems, not just economic benefits or economic value, but non-economic values also need to be promoted. And disaster preparedness, environment, and economic viability have to be promoted. And I'd like to ask Dr. Lovins about the disaster preparedness and environment and economic viability to pursue all of them simultaneously. You may have been doing that from the past, but in transition from centralized to distributed, how can these three goals be achieved simultaneously?
This is a vital point. These three goals are not at all in conflict. They all go together. They all reinforce each other. And there's actually a very powerful additional way to do that that we have not yet talked about today. So I want to mention it briefly, and it might actually help to solve the problem that Yamasaki-san just referred to of not having enough power sources. There is a parallel revolution going on in car design and car competitive strategy. And it comes from recent progress in making the car safer but 2/3 lighter in weight by making it out of ultralight materials like carbon fiber composites. This is tougher than titanium, stiffer and stronger than steel. But now we have techniques that just entered the German supply chain through a spin-off I used to chair for making cars out of such material at normal cost and at automotive speed and volume. Well, this changes everything, including buildings. Let me explain. When the car is 3 times lighter but stronger and more aerodynamic and with better tires, it takes about 3 times less energy to make it move. You can then afford to electrify it because you need 3 times fewer of the costly batteries or fuel cells. And if you therefore take the obesity out of the car, so instead of weighing 2 tons, it weighs 400 kilos, 420 kilos was the Toyota 1X concept car, the size of a Prius, 3 times lighter than normal. Then the electrification can revolutionize the electricity system, because when smart cars exchange electricity and information through smart buildings with smart grids, they add to the grid flexibility and distributed storage that help the grid to integrate varying solar and wind power. Now, the first carbon fiber electric cars have entered volume production in Germany this year from BMW and Volkswagen. The BMW i3 will soon come to Japan. You can see it in billboards on the Ginza, even last year. And of course, as we make more of the batteries and fuel cells for such vehicles that need so few we can afford to put them in, they will become cheaper. Then the fuel cells will go into the buildings, but the cars themselves can be generators if they have a fuel cell, or distributed storage to sell back to the grid when it's most valuable. Now, this suggests a very interesting business model that was just invented in the US, but let me put it in Japanese terms. Suppose that I am Toyota. I offer you 2 plug-in hybrid cars or fuel cell cars, which are exactly the same car, but this one I'll sell you 1,000,000 yen cheaper. And the only difference is that if you buy that car, when it is parked and plugged in, you will allow me to do electricity and other service exchanges with the utility in whose territory the car is parked. I will aggregate those transactions. I will do all of the settlements financially. I will guarantee that you will not have any loss of convenience or range or any of your driving capability and experience. If I want to run the battery harder because it's very valuable to sell back power at peak times, I can make that choice and replace the battery when necessary to maintain the warranty. You get the idea. I think a lot of people would be interested in buying a good car 1,000,000 yen cheaper with a very low operating cost. But Toyota would also make a lot of money on this. So would Honda, so would Nissan, so could Enet, because this aggregation opens up an enormous new field for profitable exchanges of value. And by the way, even before we have a smart grid, even before we have perhaps a digital grid, such as Abe-sensei at Todai has invented, to exchange power asynchronously between microgrids by routers, with each packet of electricity marked with its price and origin. Before all that, even when we have today's dumb grid, we can still use it in a smart way. For example, when I charge my electric car at home today, my charger looks each second at the grid frequency and adjusts the charge rate in real time according to the grid frequency. So I am dispatching a valuable service called fast regulation to the grid of the Western United States. And if my utility would pay me what they should for this service, I would make several dollars profit every night by charging my car, because the regulation service is worth more than the electricity. So I think this begins to suggest a very rich opportunity for cars to join the distributed electricity revolution in a way that reinforces all of the efficiency, environmental, and disaster preparedness and resilience goals that our panel has been discussing for buildings. And of course, it means we have distributed power sources scattered throughout the society to help sustain vital services after an emergency, much as after 3/11, the only cars working around Fukushima were the electric cars. And this, in turn, would help to nucleate the restart of the electric grid as it's repaired and keep important things working throughout society. So it's an even more exciting time than we thought. And with such a leading car industry, Japan is also in a great position to exploit this opportunity. Of course, as the fuel cells get cheaper, all of Muraki-san's cogeneration options also become even more economic for buildings. So I think we are about to see the revolutions that the panel has described going into fast forward.
ありがとうございました。日本の誇るような自動車技術を使ってですね、それも含めて
So using the car technologies by incorporated into the distributed network, I think it will give us further opportunities. So lastly, sorry for not being able to give enough time to the panelists. So from Yamasaki-san in sequence, if each panelist can make a final comment on the future initiatives, any commitment for the future. Our share is only 2%. We're only a new energy company. Out of that, new energy is only 2%, and we account for 50% of that. But the customers are having high expectations from Hokkaido to Kyushu, who keep us quite busy. But once again, with the lack of a power source, we want to satisfy the customers' expectations. We're working very hard with the new system reform by using such new system reforms, and as was discussed today, smart network and new initiatives that we would like to work on so that customers will be happy with our company. Thank you very much. If I may repeat, and maybe not to you who are here, but if you can pay attention not just about your own company or organization, but if you can pay attention to what is around you, if people start to pay more attention to that, then I think the area-wide energy efficiency and energy network will be further expanded. So Shimizu Corporation, from the first planning to the final operation, we can provide support throughout the process. So thank you. So going forward, the autonomous distributed energy network, take a cogeneration, for example. The initial investment will be quite large. So if we are to promote cogeneration, how to collect and recover the initial investment, we need to come up with some models. Otherwise, the distributed network will not be expanded. So the model to show the possibility of recovering the initial investment, such business model needs to be built to show the proof and evidence. Another issue with cogeneration is that especially for the commercial industrial area, there is not much heat demand. So if there's heat from a cogeneration, rather than wasting heat, how can we utilize the heat is another issue. As part of NET's efforts, the surplus heat to be bought back by linking with such new service. To optimize and maximize the efficiency for the cogeneration where the investment was made to lead to the recovery of the investment. So the effect to be maximized towards the investment, in other words, to generate added values so that the investment can be recovered. Such business model needs to be built. And that will lead to the brand enhancement of the local community. So by introducing cogeneration, that the local community can enjoy a better economic benefits more than before, that would actually make such local community more popular, well known from the branding perspective. That kind of framework or the scheme can be promoted and expanded. So we'd like to use that as one of the field to promote this initiative. Well, thank you very much. Sorry for the time constraint today. But using a keyword of a distributed network, many new initiatives have started. And we can get the image that it has much potential possibilities. Lastly, Inoue-san, Nasara-san, Yamazaki-san, the panelists, and Dr. Lovins who made a comment, please give them big hands in concluding this panel discussion. Thank you for all the speakers, and thank you very much, Ono-san, for moderating. So we had a discussion on distributed energy. On February 25th next year, we'll hold Revision 2014. This is an annual international conference. We'll have discussion on the new energy market. Next year is a Revision 2014 to be held on February 25th. So I'd like to solicit your attendance. Now, as for the power market reform, last week the lower house passed, and it will be discussed in the upper house next week. So I hope that you provide any opinions and feedbacks to the government. Well, thank you very much indeed for your attendance. And once again, please send them big hands to the speakers. Thank you very much.